Hi everyone. In this module, what we're going to be doing is starting to dive into actually concepting out in 3D our shovel sword. So let's get started. So we've got our ZBrush interface here, and we want to start off with our weapon. So our best bet is start off with some of the simple things that we can work with here to kind of build up. So we'll start off with a cylinder 3D mesh. Let's make sure that this is a polymesh 3D and draw it onto the canvas and turn on our edit mode. Then we can kind of pan around, move around as we need to. Also notice I do have my custom UI set up. This just makes things work a lot faster for me. Your process when you're starting out may be a little bit slow and cumbersome, just because ZBrush's interface can take a little bit of getting used to, but just start out with it, it'll start to work. So one thing I'm going to do is go over to my deformations tab here, and I'm going to just adjust a few things with size. Now I could use my transpose tool for this too, and we will, but I just wanted to try a few things here. So if I just scale this piece up, that's one thing, but I could also turn off the y-axis on some of this, and we can see here as I change the scale, I'm changing the proportions of this because I've turned off one axis of my scaling. So this means I can get kind of a nice tapered little object here, little cylinder handle. So that's pretty good. What I'm going to do up here is just start to add in more pieces as well. Let's append in another sort of cube because I want to make that hilt. So now I've got a cube in here. Now again, I do need to scale this down, but I'm going to say Shift Q in this case, and this will give me access to my sort of palette here, my quick brush palette. In here, I do have deformations anyways, so I can start to adjust the scale of stuff as well. I just need to Alt-click over here. That will change my subtool to the other piece that I want, and then I can just scale this down into a proportion that I like. I could even start to turn off different options here. So let's turn off a few of these options, just to keep the x-axis. And just in case you're wondering, the x was kind of a guess. I just got lucky on this one. And sometimes that's the case. Just kind of click through these things to try to figure out which proportion it is that you actually want to work with. So that's pretty good. I'll just kind of pull that out. Now in this case, I could use offsets to move this, but I don't have quick access to it here. Let's use our transpose tool again. So I'm going to press W, which will quickly drop me into it. And I'm just going to drag my line upwards from here. I always got to click on the mesh and drag up, and then just kind of pull this up through the middle point here so that I can move along that axis. So there we go. I got kind of a fake hilt dropped in real fast. Now what I'm going to do is start to do a few things that are a little bit different. I'm going to use the transpose tool quite a bit more here. I'm going to drop down here to the append section. I'm going to append in something that's a little bit less usual, a plain 3D mesh. So what this is you can see that this is a thin mesh. It's paper thin, basically. Now, what you'll also see is that there is nothing on the other side. Now, that's actually expected, and it's not a big deal right now. If we want to be able to see the other side, let's scroll down here into Display Properties. Here we go. And we can say double. So once we say double, it's going to be a double-sided material and should show up. Oh, we just got to make sure that we're clicking this and click double. There we go. It's per object. So now we can see both sides of it. It technically doesn't have a different side to it or a thickness, but we're just kind of seeing it in this case. So what I want to do with this is also go to initialize. Let's press Shift F to see our polyframe, also accessible as a little button right here. And we can see that we've got a fair number of polygons on this, but we could go lower if we'd used this a little bit differently. So for example, if we wanted less polygons on this, we can go into our regular tool by itself. When you start off with an object straight up without having to append it, you can change some of the properties of it. So for example, this is divided 33 times. If I start to pull this down, there are less divisions in this. In general, as a rule of thumb, when you're dealing with big shapes and forms, it's easier to work with fewer polygons than more polygons, just because it allows you to deal with big shapes very easily without the brush strokes kind of taking over and having to fiddle a lot with little small details. So in this case, I'm just going to bring that down by quite a bit. Let's even go to maybe 8. Because if you just click this number, you can set in an individual number by itself. So there we go. 8 is very low for us, and that'll actually work pretty decently. Let's in this case actually go to 9 on both, because I want a line directly down the center. This is just a little bit of pre-planning on my part, but I know I want a line here. This is going to be for our blade. So I'm going to go back up to my subtool section here and drop back into my plane 3D. In this case, I don't need this plane anymore. I'm going to just delete it and say OK. And that'll get rid of just that one tool. So now let's append in that plane 3D. This should be the correct one. We can check how many polygons it has versus this piece. Yeah. Our polygons are way less on this piece, so let's click this one, Alt-click to change. There we go. Now we've got this piece. So let's pull this up here. And I do want to extend this a bit more. So I'm going to just kind of click from one point to another, and my transpose tool will snap to all those vertices. So as I push this up here, I can get the kind of shape that I want. Now, what if I want to pull this in? Well, I'm going to click this center point and drag out. And as I pull this in, you'll notice I'm actually able to push in, and it pushes in both directions. I don't have symmetry turned on. This is what a transpose tool does by default. So that is really, really handy. Now, the problem is it's skewing, which is not really what I want. I'll just hold Shift, and it'll constrain to the axes that I've got it stuck on right now. So that's pretty good. I'll pull that in like that. And that's pretty convincing at the moment. That's kind of creating some of the shape that I want. Now, I do want to taper this a little bit. So Control W will allow me to use my Move tool, and I could start to pull this down. That's a little bit rough. Let's press X, which will turn on my symmetry mode, and I could start to try to pull this down. Now, notice, because there are so few vertices, I'm actually able to change the shape of this pretty manageably. I get a fair amount of control, and I can even kind of pull this point up. And I get a fair bit of control over this. It's actually very easy to work with when you have a lot less polygons, because I can kind of just push and pull these individual vertices to create the shape that I want. There we go, and I'm just changing the size of my brush because my brush is only going to affect those individual vertice lines. That's pretty good. If I wanted a cleaner line, what I could do in this case is Control Shift. Up here, the options are going to be a bit different. So when I Control Shift click up here, I'm basically getting a different set of brushes for what I get with a Control Shift click. In this case, Clip Curve. So what it's going to say is this brush will be selected as an active selection brush when I'm holding those modifier keys, and then when I click to use it. So basically what it's saying is I'm going to shift from what I was using before. It used to be that Control Shift click changed my masking options for viewing, so visibility masking. But in this case, it's going to be my Clip Curve brush now as opposed to my Select Rect brush. So that's all it's saying, and I can change that or turn that on and off and say that I wanted to do that. Just basically confirming. So in this case, when I drag this out, what I'm going to do is drag out in a specific direction. So when I drag this way, this dark line that you see is going to go upwards, and it's going to cut, basically just sort of flatten this surface along that angle. If I go this way, from back to front, then what you're going to see is that dark line is going downwards and is going to push this information up. Wherever that dark line is where these things are going to push. So if I come up here and just kind of drag this out, I can hold spacebar so that I can continue to move this piece around. Then I can just drop that in and I create a nice sharp line. Now it's not cutting the geometry as much as just pushing everything in that direction to that flat angle. So that's pretty good. I could work with that as well. Both of those are viable options. Again, you actually notice that there is no back to this. Just go back to Display Properties and turn on Double. Then we get both sides of this. So that's pretty good, but it's not quite a sword yet. Maybe let's pull this out a bit more. Now, if I start to pull this like this, I'm exaggerating this angle too much. So one of the things that's useful with Transpose tool is that I can hold Alt, and what it's going to do is only move the section past this point here. So basically, what it's allowing me to do is get a little bit more fine-tuned control over what I was working with. It won't move anything below this middle section. And that's pretty good. So that'll pull that out a little bit more, maybe make that look a little bit more like a sword. And I could play with that shape and start to manipulate it a bit more, but let's try one more thing. I want to just create a bit of shape to this as well. I want to bend it a little bit. Now I could do that with the move brushes as we've seen, but let's try the transpose. What I'm going to do is use my rotate button, and I'm going to rotate along the center axes, and I'm going to use the middle point to do that. So I just got to find the right angle for this. There we go, right through the center. And as I rotate, it'll bend through the center. Because remember, this is basically like it's skewering through the center. And because I have symmetry turned on, see, it won't work like that if I do it like this. So it'll just basically rotate this object. But if I press X, when I'm using symmetry, it will bend in both directions, giving me that kind of iconic sort of shape that you get from a shovel. Now again, I could bend this in using the move brush. Let's just do that real quick, just so you can see. I could kind of push this in that way as well, And that's also absolutely a viable way of doing this. Perfectly reasonable way of kind of pulling this out and working with this. But in this case, I kind of want to go back to that previous one. Let's just undo a little bit here and go back to that rotate. It's right along through the center. So again, because I can see the center point, I'm just going to drag through here and rotate right through that center point because it's going to rotate along that axis, that skewer. Great. So that gives me a good foundation to start with, and I can start maybe sculpting in some more interesting surfaces now that we've got a bit of a base built up. And we will start to do that in our next clip.